For National Adoption Awareness Month, we've teamed up with our friends at Bonfire. At Bonfire, they do a wonderful job of making fundraising easily accessible for all of us. Whether you're a designer or prefer customizing a template, you can design shirts, hats, totes, and more to sell to your community. They even have a paid design service if you'd rather have a professional designer help bring your ideas to life. You promote your Bonfire fundraising campaign to your community, then your supporters purchase products and can even leave additional donations to your journey. Bonfire then prints and ships your products directly to your sponsors. In honor of National Adoption Awareness Month, Bonfire is offering you a special promotion. Visit bonfire.com/adoptwell to create a campaign and get an extra dollar for every item sold up to $100 because you and I both know that every dollar counts.
Welcome to the Adopt Well podcast, where we discuss helpful topics for anyone touched by adoption. I'm your host, Amy Bagwell, here with my co-host, friend, and fellow adoptive mama, Macy Peralt. Maybe you've considered adopting for a while, and now you're at the point of wondering if you're really ready to just go for it. So this episode is for you. The majority of content we share usually has to do with adoption education, but in this episode, we want to focus on one step before adoption, which is actually deciding if you're ready to adopt. Because we all know that adoption is beautiful, but adoption is also hard. So before you decide to really begin the process, we have listed out quite the gamut of topics to talk through with your spouse if you're married, and questions to just ask yourself either way. So by the end of this episode, we hope that you will have the necessary tools to decide what's the best next step in your adoption journey.
Yes, well, Amy, I'm excited about this episode. And for all of you who are listening, grab your notebook and your pen because we are basically just going to fly through all of these things for you to consider. You're probably going to feel like you're drinking from a fire hose, but that's okay. We hope that you guys will feel very equipped by the end of this, and we'll have a lot of good things to take into consideration that will really help you decide if you're ready to take the leap. So, you ready, Amy?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's jump in.
All right, so just right out of the gate, I think one of the most important things is to make sure that your motives are in the right place. So, adoption is really more about finding a family for a child than just finding a child for a family. So, as an example of that, I've seen people who are like, "Oh, we have 3 biological children, but they're all boys, and we've always wanted a girl, so we'll just adopt a girl."
Yeah,
That would probably not be the best motive for taking on something as huge as adopting,
right.
um, especially for the sake of that child.
Right, because
So,
then you're kind of putting them in an idealized version of what your child will be, I guess.
yeah, absolutely.
Something they kind of have to measure up to, I guess, would be a good way to say that.
Yeah, so I think just understanding that, like we said, adoption is about finding a family for a child. And, also take into consideration the fact that you may have an extended family if there is birth family involved.
Yeah,
And so that's another big thing to make sure that your motives are there too. Like, adoption isn't about saving children.
right. And a lot of times, this is just a side note, but a lot of times they're not orphans either. We talk about sometimes adoption as an orphan, but really that's not always the case. A lot of times kids have families. They're
Yes.
just in a situation where they aren't able to parent.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so true. All right,
Okay,
number 2.
next. I would say to go ahead and start thinking about how you'll talk with your child about their adoption, just because from what Macy and I have read and studying for our own kids' sake, but also what we've observed in the adoption community, is that talking to your child about their adoption is really something that you're going to want to start doing from day one. So I would go ahead and prepare mentally for that conversation and make sure that you feel comfortable talking with a child about being adopted, and it's not necessarily something that you would want to hide.
Yeah, definitely. And there's no shame if you did not know this because I know, so Amy and I are around 30-ish, and
Give or
I would
take.
say give or take, a year or two on either side. But I would say for anyone who is an adoptee who's maybe around our age or older, it was actually somewhat of a norm for them to maybe not always know they were adopted.
Oh, yeah.
And things have really changed. And I even still get messages on the Adopt Well account from people who are like, so at what age do I have the talk with my
Right.
child? And I'm like, hopefully you never, and that's not an indictment on people who just didn't know any better. But for those of you who are just starting, hopefully you never have to have quote unquote the talk, because it will just be a normal part of conversation. If something is a secret, then it basically tells your child that there's something to be ashamed of.
Yeah.
Being adopted is not something to be ashamed of. And so I know one thing that I do, it's different depending on what age you adopt a child at. But for me, we adopted an infant and he's almost 2. And when I'm putting him to bed at night, a lot of times I practice telling him his story. And it's great because he has no idea yet what I'm saying. So if I say something and I'm like, dang, I do not want to say it like that, I'm really thankful he doesn't know. So hopefully by the time he's 3, 4, 5, and really starting to actually put the pieces together and understand, I will have somewhat nailed down how to tell him his story, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I love that. I think that's an awesome example of what to do because my daughter's 3.5 now, and every once in a while, I would say in the past few months, we've had more conversations that I feel like is like a deep conversation about adoption, and then she'll run off and like go find a new leaf or something, and I'm kind of like, "Phew, okay, we get to try that again." I don't know if that really sank in or not, but like you said, we've talked about it. There's not gonna be a huge surprise one day because it's just something we've been talking about for years now, so
Definitely. It's a normal part of conversation in life. And we're not saying like obsess about it. We have to talk about it. We have to tell strangers at the grocery store that this
no,
is
I
your
mean,
adopted child. We're
this is
just
not
saying
their
it's
sole
not a
identity.
secret.
Right, right.
For sure. All right. Next one. You want to adopt, but your spouse doesn't. That is
Yeah.
going to be an issue.
Yeah, and it's really, really common, and I don't think it's usually that they don't want to adopt, I think it's that it usually takes longer for one person to be ready than the other. Would you say that that's what you've kind of seen too?
Absolutely. More often than not, for sure. And I think
Yeah.
that's like any big decision, lifestyle change, anything. When you are married, very rarely do you both wake up and say, hey, I want to do this. Oh, no way. I was just thinking the
Right.
same exact thing.
No,
you
yeah,
know?
seriously, yes. That's a marriage 101 right there.
Yeah,
I
I
would
think
just say
sometimes we like overthink things and think they're
yeah,
like just adoption situations when really it's like, no, that's just kind of life in general.
right. So if your
Yeah,
spouse isn't ready, just wait on them. It's not worth potentially putting a strain on your marriage to rush the adoption process by any means.
for sure. And it's not fair to a child who's going to
Right.
join your family when you maybe just weren't in the healthiest place or ready
Yeah.
yet.
No, that's good. Okay, ready for the next one?
I am. I started off doing numbers and like that is just
We
we
have a
they're not
lot.
numbered
Yeah,
guys
we have
and
a lot.
we're a little sleep deprived, so
Okay, next up, I would say discuss which things that you're open to when you are looking at children to adopt potentially, such as special needs, drug or alcohol exposure, what level of openness you are ready for or not ready for. All of these things are something that you will most likely have a conversation about when you do your home study, but I think it's probably best to go ahead and think through that before you get there. And in some things, it's like, you should be okay with saying, you know what, we really aren't prepared to adopt when it comes to a child that has severe special needs. We both work, whatever that looks like. But then if you're considering, we really want a closed adoption, not an open adoption, well, I would take a pause and think, okay, why is that? Is that just our preference or is that what we think is best? And just have those conversations early.
yeah, definitely. And honestly, this is something where I think it would help if you analyzed what are my preferences versus what are my limitations. So, yeah, definitely something to think about.
For sure. Okay, go.
Next is have a realistic timeline. So,
That's a tough one.
man, it's tough. It is. We've been there. So,
hmm
the average wait in the US to adopt is 2 years. I know it's really hard because, especially with the internet, we see these stories all the time of people who adopt after a day or a week or 2 months. And unfortunately, that is a marketing tactic that a lot of agencies use, which, by the way, is a red flag. If an
Yeah.
agency is advertising themselves and they're really short wait times, I know it's hard not to get excited about that, but I would take pause on that.
Yeah.
That's just like an extra added bonus right there. But for real, the average wait is 2 years. So if you're a year into it and you are like, oh my gosh, I'm dying over here, it's been a year, just try to remind yourself you're not even halfway, technically, to the average, even though it feels like a lifetime.
Yeah, that is it, and it really does feel like a lifetime when you're just waiting, and every day feels like, "Is today gonna be the day? Is today gonna be the day?" But
Yeah.
it is deceiving because you have people who it looks like, "Oh, wow, they were only, waiting for, like, a week." Well, also, you don't know how long it was before they got to the point where they were even an active family. I mean, the internet in general can be deceiving, so Macy made a good point, just, have a realistic timeline.
Yeah, and honestly, another thing on that too is know just what we were just talking about, preferences versus limitations. Just know that the more limited that you are in the things that you're willing to say yes to, you will wait longer.
Oh, yeah.
If
Yeah.
you I mean, I can't think of many examples, but like say for example, you only want to adopt twins.
Right.
You are probably, not always, but you're probably going to be waiting longer if you're saying no to every situation until you are waiting for twins. Do you know what I'm saying?
For sure. And I mean, I think that, not to go back to the last point, but really just knowing what's a preference and what's a limitation. I mean, there are definitely situations where, for a good reason, you feel like you are specifically called to adopt a child. Let's say that you have a child who is, Korean, for example, and you want to adopt another Korean child. That makes perfect sense. You want to have another child in the family who shares the same nationality, looks the same, or whatever as your current child. So it makes sense that you would have a preference on the type of child that you adopt. However, all in all, um, I would I don't wanna be, bossy here, but I would just really consider opening your preferences. Be open-minded. Anyways,
Yep.
that's my soapbox. I'm off.
It's good. It's
Okay,
good.
where were we? Okay,
All right. Next up.
yep, you're ready to adopt, but you're not sure which route is the best for you. So, we just did a post on this on Instagram recently, but there's all different ways that you can adopt a child. Domestic infant adoption, embryo adoption. Maybe you want to adopt from foster care. Maybe you're interested in international adoption, even kinship adoption. And the reality is that there are children in every single one of those avenues, so to speak, who are in need of a family. So I would just say, like, consider what your family, the best thing that you could provide a child, and pray, research, and just dive in. There's no one route or route. There's no one route that is better than the other.
Yeah, it's so true. And honestly, just be prepared to be confident in what you go with because people will find something to say no matter what. If you're doing international adoption, you're going to have people say, "But why would you do that?
They're
There
right
are
in our
kids right here in our
backyard.
own."
Yeah.
Exactly. And if you are adopting from foster care, well, that's going to be hard on your family or you're going to get too attached. I mean,
Right. It's
people
always
are going
something.
to have something to say about literally everything.
Yeah.
So you just pray about it. You do your research, think about the limitations and the things that are going to be best for your family and for a child coming into your family. And then ultimately go with what you feel works the best for you guys. I say
Yep.
you guys because I'm from Maine. We don't say y'all, but I
Y'all,
want to say y'all.
you should.
But
Just come on over.
sometimes I do say it, but I mean, I kind of feel like a fraud even though I've lived in the South for 10 years.
I was born in Alabama, grew up in Georgia, I live in South Carolina, so honestly, if I don't say y'all, then I would be a fraud.
South Carolina. Okay. I mean,
Alright, your turn.
all right. All right. All right. We're really getting through these. Okay. Next up, finances.
Dun, dun, dun.
Dun, dun, dun. This always gets special when you talk about finances. But did you know that the average cost of adoption in the US is roughly, because I don't have a statistic to point to, roughly $40,000 to $60,000.
It's mind-blowing, truly.
Truly mind-blowing.
It is.
But, okay, so let's talk about this. We do understand the average Joe does not have $40,000 to $60,000 in the bank.
Right.
So what do? I think, first off, this is just my opinion. Amy, you can actually disagree with me if you want, but
Well, thank you.
you're welcome. I do not think there is necessarily a right or a wrong answer. Because if people are looking at it and saying, like, well, do I have to wait until I have $50,000 in the bank? Or can I start pursuing adoption? I don't feel right saying,
No,
oh, you have $0, go for it
I
anyway.
think the thing is, if you don't have it all, that's understandable, but have a plan. Have an idea and have have an awareness that it could range to be that much. Now, because like you said, it's an average, that doesn't mean that it always is gonna cost that much.
Right.
It may cost 25,000. It may cost way more. It may cost so much that you say, "You know what? Unfortunately, we would love to adopt this child, but this situation just isn't possible for us. So this isn't right?" So if you don't have it all, listen, we understand that for sure. I would say just have a plan. I mean, I'll tell a very personal story here. When Charlie and I began our first adoption process, we knew that we wanted to adopt or that we were going to have fertility treatments or something for a while. And so we had been saving up for probably 2.5, 3 years. And even then, we still didn't have it all necessarily, but we had been intentionally saving for a long time, didn't have to do much fundraising, and it was below the national average. The cost was below the national average. But recently, we are actually planning to adopt again, and we're having to do more fundraising because it was not something that we had planned for a long time, but it was a situation that we felt like we needed to say yes to, undoubtedly. So we're having to do a little more fundraising this time, but we have put together a plan and we're praying that it that it goes as planned, but we'll see.
Yeah, definitely. For sure. And I think that having a plan is the most important part, like you said. And honestly, another thing that I've seen people do and I've seen you do is be willing to kind of work your hiney off.
Oh,
You
I
know,
mean, yeah,
you're not going
the
on
plan
tropical
cannot be
vacations.
right. No,
You're willing to like make arts and crafts. Like, I don't know,
right.
whatever
The
you got to do.
the plan is you save, 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 and you hustle, hustle, hustle. It cannot, I mean, no offense if this is what you did, maybe it worked for you, but the plan cannot be to launch a GoFundMe and just think that the money's just gonna roll in 30 grand, you know?
Absolutely. And
It's
yeah,
it's probably not gonna work that way.
no. And that could be a whole nother conversation.
For sure, for sure.
We'll have that conversation, but we're gonna need to prepare.
Okay,
LOL. All right.
next.
Is it
What
your turn?
I think it is. I'll just go for it.
Okay.
I would say, and this looks different for literally every person because we're all individuals, but spend some time, take a second and think if you've got any grief that you need to work through so that you're not trying to put a band-aid on some grief or fill a void of something like infertility or miscarriage or something of the sort. Adopting a child's not going to fill a void. And I mean, I imagine that it could be detrimental to an adoptee if you're expecting them to fulfill a certain role or to take the place of maybe even a hurt that you've experienced. And so that's not the case for everyone, but if you feel like you've got some grief that hasn't really been tended to well, I would say take care of yourself first before you bring another human into your grief process.
Yeah,
That's
I
a tough one.
absolutely agree. One thing that comes to mind, and you kind of touched on this at the beginning, but to go along with this, I would say, and I'm speaking from personal experience here, if the idea of your child that you adopt, if the idea of their birth family being in the picture scares you, if you're only okay with the idea of a closed adoption, you maybe should continue to work through your grief a little bit more. Because ultimately, adding a child to your family through adoption is way different than having biological children, and that is okay. But you have to be prepared for the fact that in adoption, Kids literally have two mothers and two fathers, regardless of whether they are present or not present in the child's life. And so I just think, even for me, I did not fully understand open adoption at first. When we first started thinking about adopting, we came to it after going through infertility, having miscarriages, and I really had to understand, okay, this is going to be very different than if I have another biological child. There's going to be another family involved. And I came to the place where now that's all I want is an open adoption, and for my child to be able to have a relationship with birth family. And but it takes time to get there, especially if you're coming from a place of grief. So I would just check your heart on that.
Okay, let's see. Where are we at? Oh, yeah, it's your turn.
All right. Next up, is your marriage stable? We already talked about this a little bit. I don't think we need to get too into this, but ultimately, we don't want to bring a child into a family that is not even in a good place. So, if you need to get some help for your marriage, if you need to take some time to work on it, do it. You will never regret taking the time to work on that and invest in your marriage before you bring a child into the picture.
True. Do it either way. Whether you bring in a child into the picture or not, go ahead and invest in that marriage.
When are you writing a marriage book, Amy?
I'm not. I'm not.
Man.
But,
All right.
I'm trying to love my husband and let him love me.
Let me love you.
Some days it goes better than others, but, we're still trying. So we're about to have our 10-year anniversary. Wow.
Okay. Okay. I
Okay.
love it. You know what's funny?
What?
We just had our 8-year anniversary, and guess who forgot? Both
You.
of us.
Both. Oh, gosh.
That's the reality of having 4 children.
Woo.
We were like, "Oh my gosh, tomorrow is our 8-year anniversary." We were literally blindsided. No gifts, no plans, nothing. Like, "Well, I guess this is it." So special.
Well, here we
It's okay.
are. It's okay.
Here we are, it's good.
We've made it. Anyways, okay, let's go on. Have you considered well, pause. This is something I'm actually in the middle of right now, so I feel empathy for this for sure. But have you considered childcare and the realities of parenting? Obviously, this is true not just for adoption, but I mean, Macy, you can obviously speak to this, but even having kids biologically, they don't stay babies forever. They're eventually going to have to um, have you take care of them all the time and or go to school. So, that's something you're going to be asked about in your home study is what are your plans for childcare? And maybe you're planning to be a stay-at-home parent, or maybe you need to start looking into daycares. I mean, I'll go ahead and tell you that childcare is very expensive, not to be scary, but it is. So that's something to consider as well as you're budgeting for adoption. Also budgeting for what life post-placement is going to look like for you when you have a child and a child's been placed in your family. Diapers, food, formula, all the things. Just keep in mind. I would also say this is simple, but it's something that people are confused on sometimes is that you don't have to necessarily own a house or be married, all of these things that you kind of have in mind potentially to adopt. So let's say that you're a single girl and you think, you know what, I think I could do this. Well, you can. Single girl living in an apartment, you can adopt. So even if it feels crazy, I would go ahead and research the possibilities that are available to you. So we actually did an episode 9, I believe, is that right, Macy, on home study, like what to expect at your home study?
Yep.
I would reference that and go back. Well, if you decide that adoption is right for you, then that would be a great second episode to listen to if you haven't heard it already, because it just has some helpful tips of what to expect before you get there, because the home study is really not as scary as people make it out to be, but it is good to be prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. I could not agree more.
Well, I feel like we've just listed out like a whole fire hydrant worth of information.
We totally did. And honestly, there's probably more, but I think we can wrap it up for now and.
For sure. And I feel like, I just want to say this. I feel like a lot of the things that we've just mentioned, and because we have said so many things, I mean, I don't want it to feel heavy or negative or overwhelming at all by any means. Adoption truly is beautiful. It is a multifaceted thing. Like we said at the very beginning, it is beautiful, but it's also hard. So you probably already know that it's beautiful. We're just trying to bring forth some of the things that aren't as common thought about as you look to begin this process, and bring some real talk, so to speak, to the conversation about it. So I hope that you don't walk away thinking, oh gosh, we're not ready to adopt at all.
No.
The reality is, and I mean, you might not be ready to adopt. You might not be ready to adopt, and you need to take some time to pause on it. But you also might feel like you're not ready to adopt, but really you are. Really you do have what it takes. And if you feel like that God is telling you this is the next step for your family, or if you feel like extremely passionate about this and that you are going to continue pursuing what it takes to become a great adoptive parent, I say go for it. Even if it feels like you're not ready, go for it. Dive into the education, research all the agencies you can research. And if you get to the point where you are ready to go for it, another great tool, where we mentioned this earlier, but if you're kind of at the fork in the road of which route is the best to pursue for you, I would really recommend spoonfulofjordan.com. She wrote an incredible workbook that is essentially just some helpful resources, some things to consider, and a workbook to walk through before you adopt, which honestly is so, so helpful. And she is as sweet as they come.
Yes, fantastic resource.
All right. I think we've done it.
Cool.
You guys will post some of the stuff that we discussed in the show notes, so go ahead and check those out. And also, I would ask you that if this is your first episode and you found it helpful, or even if you didn't find it helpful, to leave us a review before you go, an honest review, because we really do want to know what you thought about it, because we always want to get better at what we're doing. So I would say thank you so much for listening. If you're not already, follow us on social media at AdoptWell, and tune in for the next episode.